Nelson Mandela told the world he was Xhosa, a Thembu chief's descendant, rooted in the red soil of the Eastern Cape. That identity shaped everything: his politics, his pride, his place in history. But when DNA researchers mapped his genetic lineage, they found something his family history had never recorded: a deeper, older origin, one that connected him to a story far larger than South Africa, and one that his own oral tradition could never have preserved. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Nelson Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in the village of Mvezo, on the banks of the Mbashe River in the Eastern Cape. His father, Godla Henry Mafakanyiswa, was a chief of the Thembu people and a counselor to the royal house. From the moment of his birth, Mandela's place in the world was defined by lineage. He was not simply a child born into a family. He was born into a position, a history, and a set of obligations that stretch back through generations of named ancestors. The Thembu are a branch of the Xhosa Speculative peoples, and within that world, ancestry is not background, it is identity itself. A man's clan name tells others where he stands, who he owes loyalty to, and who owes loyalty to him. Mandela carried the clan name Madiba, the designation of his specific ancestral line within the Thembu, and that name followed him for the rest of his life. When South Africans called him Madiba in his final years, they were not using an affectionate nickname. They were addressing him by the name of his ancestors. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Mandela described his origins with the certainty of a man who had never had reason to question them. He traced his father's line through the Thembu royal house, named his forebears, and placed himself within a genealogical structure that connected him to the history of his people. That sense of known origin was not incidental to his character. It was foundational. His understanding of justice, belonging, and resistance grew directly from a culture in which knowing where you came from meant knowing who you were. But lineage in oral tradition moves in the directions that matter most to those preserving it. Political lines are recorded, royal connections are maintained. What tends to fall away, quietly and without intention, are the older, more tangled roots. The ancestors who do not fit cleanly into the story a community tells about itself. The lines that cross boundary no one wished to acknowledge. Mandela knew exactly who he was. What the DNA would reveal is how much further back that story actually went. The Xhosa people have carried their history in words for centuries. Before written records, before archives, before any external institution thought to document the lives of Southern Africa's peoples, the Xhosa preserved their past through Izibongo, praise poetry recited by trained oral historians who memorized the names, deeds, and lineages of chiefs and clans across generations. These were not casual storytellers. They were specialists, custodians of a living archive, and the accuracy of what they preserved was a matter of communal honor. Within this tradition, the paternal line held the greatest importance. A man's father, grandfather, and the chiefs who came before them were the anchors of the genealogical record. These names were repeated, reinforced, and passed down with deliberate care. Mandela's paternal ancestry was preserved in exactly this way: traceable, named, and consistent across multiple sources. The Thembu royal connection was not a family legend. It was a documented genealogical fact supported by both oral tradition and later historical records. The maternal line was a different matter. Across many African oral traditions, maternal ancestry was recorded with less consistency. Mothers were named, but their mothers less often, and their mothers' mothers rarely. The further back the maternal line reached, the thinner the record became. This was not concealment. It was the natural consequence of which connections a community found most politically and socially essential to preserve. Royal descent moved through fathers. The maternal side carried its own significance, but a different kind, and one that the formal genealogical tradition was less equipped to hold across many generations. For Mandela specifically, the historical record on his maternal ancestry grows sparse well before it reaches the depth that DNA can now access. Genealogists who examined his family history before the era of genetic research noted the asymmetry. The paternal record was rich. The maternal record faded. That gap was not suspicious. It was ordinary. But it meant that when researchers turned to the question of where Mandela's maternal line truly originated, the oral tradition had no answer to give. The record simply ended somewhere in the past, at a point no living historian could see beyond. What lay on the other side of that silence was exactly what the DNA was designed to find. By the early 2000s, genetic genealogy had moved from a laboratory curiosity to a legitimate historical tool. Researchers studying human migration patterns had begun building global databases of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome sequences, cataloging the genetic signatures of populations across every continent. For the first time, it was possible to ask questions that no document, no oral tradition, and no archive could answer. Questions about where a family line had been 10 generations back, or 20, or 50. The tool that made this possible rested on a straightforward biological principle. Mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mother to child without recombination, preserves a direct record of the maternal line stretching back through time unchanged. Y chromosome DNA does the same for the paternal line, passed from father to son across generations without alteration. Neither mixes with the other parent's genetic material. Both act as unbroken threads running backward through history, connecting living individuals to population groups that existed long before any written record began. When researchers turned these tools toward Nelson Mandela, the work required identifying living individuals who carried unbroken lines of descent from his known maternal and paternal ancestors. This was not a simple task. Mandela's direct male line had to be traced forward to living male descendants who could provide a Y chromosome sample. His maternal line required identifying women or men who had inherited mitochondrial DNA through an unbroken chain of mothers reaching back to Mandela's own maternal ancestry. The study drew on both lineages simultaneously, which was itself unusual. Most genetic genealogy projects focus on one line at a time. Examining both the paternal and maternal threads together meant that two separate haplogroup results would emerge, each telling a different part of the same story. And because the two lines trace entirely separate ancestral paths, there was no guarantee they would tell a consistent story. They might point in completely different directions. That possibility, that Mandela's paternal and maternal origins might belong to different worlds entirely, was not a concern the researchers set out to prove. It was simply a consequence of how the science worked. The sequences would say what they said, and when the results came back, both lines had something unexpected to report. The Y chromosome result came back first, and it told a story older than the Thembu kingdom, older than the Xhosa nation, older than almost any ethnic or political identity that exists in Southern Africa today. Mandela's paternal haplogroup was identified as A, the designation researchers assigned to one of the most ancient male lineages ever detected in the human population. Haplogroup A is not simply old in the way that all human DNA is old. It is old in a specific and remarkable sense. It belongs to a branching point so close to the origin of modern human paternal lineages that geneticists sometimes describe its carriers as living representatives of the earliest chapters of human male ancestry on Earth. The lineage is found today almost exclusively among the Khoisan peoples of Southern Africa and a small number of related groups, populations who were present in this part of the continent long before the Bantu-speaking migrations that would eventually shape the ethnic landscape that Mandela was born into. This result did not contradict Mandela's Thembu identity, but it complicated the picture in a historically significant way. The Bantu expansion, which carried Xhosa-speaking peoples southward across sub-Saharan Africa over several centuries, did not move through an empty landscape. It moved through territories already occupied by Khoisan and related hunter-gatherer populations whose presence in southern Africa stretched back tens of thousands of years. As the expansion advanced, those populations were absorbed, displaced, or assimilated in varying degrees. Their genetic signatures did not disappear. They were folded into the lineages of the incoming groups, often without acknowledgement and rarely with any formal record. What the Y chromosome results suggested was that somewhere in Mandela's direct paternal ancestry, that process of absorption had occurred. A Khoisan male lineage had entered the line that would eventually produce a Thembu chief son. The oral tradition had preserved the Thembu connection faithfully. What it had no mechanism to record was what came before. The paternal result was striking, but the researchers had a second result waiting, and the maternal line pointed somewhere else entirely. The mitochondrial DNA result placed Mandela's maternal line within haplogroup L0, a designation that carries a significance few genetic markers can match. Haplogroup L0 is not simply an African lineage. It is the oldest known human mitochondrial lineage on Earth. Geneticists who study human migration and population history regard L0 as the deepest branch of the human maternal family tree, the haplogroup closest to the common maternal ancestor of all living humans. Its carriers today are found predominantly among the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa, the same population cluster that the Y chromosome result had already connected to Mandela's paternal line. In both directions, through his father and through his mother, the DNA was pointing to the same ancient source. The oral tradition had preserved Mandela's Xhosa and Thembu identity with accuracy. What it could not have recorded was that beneath those identities, in both his maternal and paternal lines, ran genetic threads belonging to one of the oldest human populations ever to have lived on this part of the earth. The Khoisan had been present in southern Africa for at least 100,000 years before the Bantu expansion reshaped the continent's demographic landscape. Their DNA did not vanish when newer populations arrived. It persisted, carried forward in lineages that no longer identified as Khoisan, in families that had long since become Xhosa, Thembu, Zulu, and dozens of other identities. Mandela was one of those carriers. His cells held a record his community's oral tradition had no language to express, because the events that created it had happened far beyond the reach of any living memory. The convergence of both results, the ancient paternal haplogroup and the oldest maternal lineage known to science, gave the findings a weight that neither result alone could have carried. This was not a single anomaly in one line of descent. It was a pattern. Both threads of Mandela's direct ancestry reach back to the same deep human origin, independently, through entirely separate lines. The DNA had answered the question the oral record left open, but in doing so, it had raised a question of its own. Mandela's results were striking on their own, but they did not exist in isolation. They were part of a larger pattern that geneticists had been documenting across southern Africa for years. And understanding that pattern was essential to grasping what the findings actually meant. Large-scale DNA studies of southern African populations had already established something that the continent's political and ethnic history had consistently obscured. The Khoisan peoples, long marginalized, displaced, and in some regions nearly eliminated as a distinct population, had left a genetic legacy that ran through communities far beyond those that still identified as Khoisan. Their DNA appeared in Xhosa, Zulu, Sotho, and dozens of other Bantu-speaking populations at frequencies that surprised researchers who had assumed the Bantu expansion had largely replaced the earlier inhabitants. It had not. It had absorbed them, and the evidence of that absorption was written into the genomes of millions of people who had no knowledge of it. Mandela's DNA placed him squarely within this broader pattern. His ancient paternal and maternal lineages were not anomalies. They were evidence of the same deep human continuity that population geneticists had been finding across the region. What made his case significant was not its uniqueness, but its symbolism. This was the man whose name had become synonymous with the struggle against a system built entirely on the fiction that human populations were biologically and culturally distinct, that racial categories were natural and fixed, that identity could be classified and separated with precision. His own genome contradicted that fiction at its root. Apartheid's racial classification system had assigned every person in South Africa to a rigid category: white, black, colored, Indian. Those categories determined where a person could live, work, study, and whom they could marry. The system depended on the idea that these distinctions were real in some fundamental biological sense. Mandela spent 27 years in prison resisting that idea. His DNA, examined decades after his release, offered its own form of testimony. The man who argued that human identity transcended racial division carried in his own cells the biological proof that such divisions had always been a simplification. The science had confirmed the politics. And there was still one more layer to examine. Mandela rarely spoke about genetics. He spoke constantly about identity, and what he said across decades of speeches, letters, and interviews created a record that the DNA findings now sit alongside in an unexpected way. His most quoted statement on the subject came from the dock at the Rivonia trial in 1964, where he faced the possibility of a death sentence. He told the court that the ideal of a democratic and free society was one for which he was prepared to die. But less quoted, and perhaps more relevant here, were the words he repeated throughout his life about the artificial nature of the divisions apartheid enforced. He did not believe that the categories the apartheid state had assigned to human beings reflected anything real or permanent. He believed they were instruments of control imposed on a population whose actual history was far more entangled than any classification system could capture. The DNA findings do not validate Mandela's politics through biology. That is not how science works, and it is not a claim the researchers made. But they do add a layer of historical irony that is difficult to ignore. The man who devoted his life to dismantling a system of racial classification carried in his own genome a lineage that defied the very categories that system depended upon. His paternal and maternal lines both reached back to a population the apartheid state had classified separately, marginalized systematically, and largely written out of the national story it told about itself. The Xhosa connection in Mandela's DNA was not something he could have known. It was not something his family's oral tradition preserved. It was not something that any document in any archive recorded. It existed only in his cells, waiting for a technology that did not exist during his lifetime to bring it to the surface. What the findings ask us to consider is not whether Mandela was something other than what he claimed to be. He was exactly what he claimed to be. What they ask is whether the story of where he came from was ever as simple as any single identity, any single tradition, any single name could contain. The answer, written into his DNA, was no. The DNA confirmed what the oral record could not preserve, and what no archive had ever recorded. In both his paternal and maternal lines, Nelson Mandela carried genetic signatures belonging to one of the oldest human populations on Earth. The Xhosa connection was not incidental. It ran through both threads of his direct ancestry, independently through entirely separate lines of descent. That convergence was not something researchers had predicted, and it was not something the historical record had given any reason to expect. What the science could confirm, it confirmed with clarity. Mandela's Thembu identity was real. His place within the Xhosa-speaking world was documented, legitimate, and historically grounded. The DNA did not displace any of that. What it revealed was the layer beneath, the older human story that the formation of Xhosa and Thembu identity had absorbed without recording. The oral tradition had preserved what mattered most to the community that carried it. The genome preserved everything else. But genetic genealogy has a boundary, and that boundary is precise. A haplogroup identifies a population pattern. It does not name individuals. It cannot recover the specific ancestors who carried that lineage forward across the generations between the ancient Xhosa population and the Thembu household where Mandela was born. The people who bridged that distance, the men and women through whom that genetic thread passed, have no names in any record. The oral tradition did not preserve them. No document recorded them. The DNA confirms they existed, but it cannot reach them. That is the limit the science runs up against and cannot cross. The haplogroup is a marker, not a biography. It points toward a human story without being able to tell it. Mandela opened Long Walk to Freedom with a line about the hills of the Eastern Cape, the land where his story began. The DNA pushed that beginning back further than any living tradition had imagined, past the formation of the Thembu kingdom, past the Bantu expansion, back to a population that had been present in southern Africa since before recorded history began. His story did not start where he thought it did. It started much earlier, and much of it, even now, remains untold. DNA confirmed what Nelson Mandela's own politics had always argued, that identity is layered, ancient, and far more complex than any single story can hold. His cells carried lineages older than the Thembu kingdom, older than the Xhosa nation, reaching back to the earliest chapters of human life on Earth. The oral record preserved what it could. The science recovered what it could not. But one truth remains beyond the reach of both. The names of the people who carried that story forward, generation by generation, until it became him.